Today on KHOL, we have the special honor of speaking with some of wildlife art's most influential players. We've got wildlife art scholar Dr. David Wagner, painter Robert Bateman, and sculptor Kent Ullberg joining me in the studio. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we're recording this discussion via phone today because everyone's off-site. But I know that each of you is acquainted with Jackson Hole. In fact, Kent and Robert, you both have had shows curated by David Wagner at the National Wildlife Art Museum. Is that correct?
Yes, we have. Yes, indeed.
And I always kind of think of Jackson as an epicenter for wildlife art. Do you guys see it that way?
Bateman speaking, it is the epicenter. It's the place in the whole world. It's the mecca where wildlife artists come. I was just talking to some wildlife artists last weekend from all different parts of the world at a bird art show in Wisconsin, and they're looking forward to going to Jackson Hole. It's the mecca.
I couldn't agree more. I totally agree with Bob. It's right at the edge, of course, of the Yellowstone where we have all the wildlife, and then we have the National Museum dedicated to our passion.
Well, and also you have a plethora of wonderful galleries. So you have the downtown commercial aspect of it as well, where people can shop for wildlife art and find great paintings and sculptures, as well as seeing the masters in the museum. So there's that added value as well.
And David, you're actually on your way. You're in the airport right now, en route to Wyoming as we record this, and you're making your way to Jackson by Wednesday for a lecture and a book signing for your book, American Wildlife Art. And I know it's hard to sum it up, but can you give us a quick idea of what your book is about?
Well, my book tells the story from the earliest wildlife art in North America, and perhaps having a Canadian on the phone with us today, Robert Bateman, I might just add that my book may be a bit of a misnomer. It should really be North American wildlife art because he's representing Canada, and others from Canada are mentioned in my book as well. But it works its way from the earliest artists such as John White in the 17th century, up through Audubon in the early 19th century, up to Carl Rungius, who's so well known at the National Wildlife Museum, and then up to our greatest masters today, Kent Ullberg and Robert Bateman. The last two chapters treat both of their current work, which is really modern art in a sense, the most modern art, and also I'm pleased to say that Bob and Kent wrote the introduction and foreword, respectively.
Right, I was just going to get to that. So why did you choose? They must have a pretty big hand in the art world if you chose them to write the foreword and the introduction.
Well, from my perspective as a historian and a curator and a former museum director, I'd say they are the most influential artists in their media working today. Bob being so influential, not only with his own signature style and advancing it, the style of wildlife art in general to even a higher aesthetic, what I would refer to as postmodernism, but also in the courage that he's taken with the messages that he embodies in his work, messages against large-scale industrial strength commercial logging or commercial fishing, and Ullberg in the same sense, developing and really advancing a postmodern style in new media such as stainless steel, and then really with powerful environmental messages. Both these guys are at the top of the field and arguably among the most influential wildlife artists of all time.
Boy, I better come down from about 2 feet off the ground. Thank you, David.
Well, while we're on the subject of accolades and successful careers, we should stop and say congratulations, Robert, because I know you just received a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yes, I did, from the Society of Animal Artists. That is the creme de la creme of all the wildlife artists in the world living, and some of the society members, of course, have passed on, unfortunately. So I think a measure of success for anybody in whatever field you're in would be to be recognized by your peers, not by the general public or by some university giving you an honorary doctorate, but by your peers. And that's what that was. And that's huge. It's right up there in the great moments of my life.
Kent Ullberg here. I just wanted to enforce that. It's certainly well received. It's absolutely unanimous amongst us wildlife artists, and Bob is our ambassador. He makes us look good. He makes wildlife art look actually like a serious art. And, just having had a show, for example, in St. Petersburg, the art capital of Russia, and so on, Bob is our hero.
No, thanks, Kent.
Well, fantastic. Well, I understand this is also the first award of its kind, and they decided to sort of create this award for you. Is that correct?
I wouldn't be able to say they created it for me. I happen to be the first, but I'm sure others will have lifetime and are having, and in fact have already had great lifetime achievement. So I expect there'll be others forthcoming.
And all three of you were there to witness this historic moment.
Absolutely.
Yes, we were.
Yes, it was the 50th anniversary annual exhibition of the Society of Animal Artists held at the San Diego Museum of Natural History in Balboa Park, adjacent to the famous San Diego Zoo. So it was quite a big event.
So I get the idea that you guys are buddies, that you guys have known each other for a while.
Yep.
That's true.
We really never see enough of each other because we live in all different parts of the continent. But when we get together, it's just like we never did say goodbye. And just continue the sentence we left off the last time.
I just want to say also that we spent countless hours discussing and arguing about art and the good times together. We know where we stand philosophically together too.
And I think all wildlife artists are not interested in what you might call capital A art or art of the art museums. We three happen to be, and there are others, but many are not. Don't pay attention to the whole world of art per se. But that's one of these endless discussions about the place of wildlife art in the whole art world.
Well, I do want to get into the philosophy of wildlife art as well. After all these accolades inside the subculture of kind of wildlife art, I was surprised to read in your introduction to David Wagner's book, Robert, that you said in many ways you regret the term wildlife art. I wanted to ask you what you meant by that.
Yes, it's unfortunate that, but I guess art is always divided up into all different sections. There's futurism and cubism and abstract expressionism, etc. There's all these. Those are isms or styles. Ours is kind of relegated by subject matter, and I think that's what's held against us. I'll never forget years ago, if we have time just for a short story, I went on a pilgrimage to Sweden, Holland and Sweden, to see works by the great 19th and early 20th century, maybe in many ways the Michelangelo of all wildlife artists, Bruno Lilliefors. And I went to several different locations, including Göteborg. Probably saying that wrong, Kent, but that's my attempt.
Pretty close.
And I was at the art museum where this guy who paints wildlife art, Lilliefors, was. He's got many pieces in the collection there, and I didn't have any books out then. My first book came out in '81, and this was in the late '70s, and so I was sitting there on the steps with the curator of art for this great art museum, and I showed him some photographs of my work. I had 8x10 prints of my work because I didn't have any reproductions out in those days either. And he was going, "Oh, this is good stuff. This is marvelous. Oh, wonderful. We'll have to try to get a budget and bring your paintings over here to Sweden so you can have a show at the Museum of Natural History." And I said, "You're the curator of the Museum of Art, and I will have a show at the Museum of Natural History. What is this?" And he immediately started to backpedal and said, well, if you're you paint ships, you'll show at a marine museum. If you paint railway trains, you'd show at a railway museum. And I felt like saying, but I didn't. If you paint wine bottles and guitars, you show at a wine bottle and guitar museum. If you paint nudes, you'll show at a nude museum. What's this with subject matter? It's either good art or not good art. And why should subject matter, be a topic at all for categorization or discussion? And so, yeah, it's that kind of thing I have in mind. We categorize ourselves because I paint human beings in straight landscapes as well, but I mostly paint wildlife because I'm a naturalist.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you sort of regret being pigeonholed by the subject matter that you're painting.
But yeah, we do it to ourselves. Yes, it's true. It's a little bit the same with Western art and cowboy art, but the other art, where I call them the priesthood, don't do this. And of course, they it seems all through history until the Middle Ages, all great cultures had wildlife in their art. The art of Egypt and the art of Greece, almost all cultures, Japan, China, all around the world, normally showed wildlife in their pictures. during the Middle Ages, and I don't know whether we can blame the church, and they kind of rejected nature back in those days. Nature was the enemy. Domestic animals were okay, and you have domestic animals all through the history of art. Man's best friend, the dog, and horses and cows and sheep and all that. But it was a wild animal, and you're looking at it eye to eye with respect, not hanging up by its heels with a bunch of grapes ready for the table. You couldn't paint wildlife eye to eye with respect. It had to be either quarry or it had to be domestic animals. And that applies right up through Picasso and so on. There's very, very few artists who include wildlife. I mean, art museums and curators who include wildlife.
Yeah. Christy, can I address this too out of sort of my point of view?
Yes, I was going to ask you to, if you could, actually.
Yes. Artists have always sort of reflected the cultural and concerns of their time, and of course Bob addressed, modernism, but before we had classicism and the neoclassicism, and where the cultures of concern was looking back to classical ideals and so on, through history, and then impressionists, they tried to break with that and were rejected from the salon in Paris and so on. But today, the greatest concern today on a global scale is the environment.
Right.
And us as wildlife artists, we are addressing a cultural and environmental concern. We are right in the mainstream as far as I'm concerned. So we should really be considered contemporary artists that address contemporary considerations.
Perfect.
Right. Does wildlife art have, or should it have, a larger goal than just representing the wilderness?
There are several ways of addressing this. One way is, of course, that both Bob and I have done. Bob showing nets with captured animals, with mammals in there, dolphins in there. I have done a sculpture in protest against Prince William Sound with a dying eagle and all that stuff. But that's sort of an activist approach. My favorite approach is really to show people my love for nature and show people how beautiful nature is. And through that way, I feel communicating that, I feel that one can maybe even be more successful. But, there are both ways of addressing it.
Yeah, I paint what I celebrate the beauty and the variety. We're wiping out variety now. I mean, everybody agrees that birds are pretty and lions are beautiful and so on, but it's the variety that we're losing. So I celebrate not only the beauty but the variety, because if it isn't worth celebrating, then why bother? And we basically, starting from little kids, have to fall in love with nature. The great biodiversity guru, emeritus professor from Harvard, E.O. Wilson, has written a book called Biophilia, Being in Love with Living Things. And so that's what all of us do, try to draw people's attention and help them fall in love with these living things. If you don't fall in love with it, then why bother, and why vote for higher taxes to have enforcement of rules and regulations out in the Gulf and that kind of thing, and cleaning up pollution, etc., all those sinister things that are happening. But I think, by the same token, a lot of the priesthood, as I call them, the contemporary curators of these art museums that have keys to the kingdom and the budgets, they don't like art to be nice. Nowadays, art has to be edgy and tough and make you squirm a little bit if you want to make it into these places, or not easily digested and easily understood. They think it's too much like Rice Krispie squares or something, and they would prefer caviar and a twist of bitter lemon on dry toast that the general public don't care for. So one of the things that's happening in the art museums, of course, is they are not having people come through their doors because people don't get it and they're made uncomfortable or it just is boring. Whereas if there's ever any shows of including wildlife art, or even great painters like Norman Rockwell, very popular painters, did Saturday Evening Post covers, then they flock to the museums. The cash registers go ka-ching, ka-ching. So I think museums are in some ways being forced to come around. And I think the old school of these modernist, sort of pig-headed Politburo are passing away now. And I think we're going to have much more openness in the art museums. I can see it coming.
For those of you who are just joining us on KHOL 89.1, we're speaking with wildlife art scholar David Wagner, sculptor Ken Ullberg, and painter Robert Bateman. Robert, to me it sounds like you're speaking about sort of an antagonism between modern art and wildlife art. Actually, David writes, it was well known in the wildlife art world, at least among top artists such as Robert Bateman and Ken Ullberg, that the genre was not generally recognized or held in high regard among elite tastemakers. Can we address some of the common criticisms that we hear from these elite tastemakers?
Well, I would flip it around, Christy, and take what Bob and Kent have said and look at it in sort of a reverse way. And by that I mean art historians, including myself, often try to identify the great artists by looking at their ability to change trends and create new mega trends themselves. That is, influential artists are recognized because of the breadth and the depth of their influence in all sorts of ways. And whereas, yes, in the, say, 40s and 50s and 60s with, pop art and Dada before that and, all the isms that Bob and Kent had mentioned, we've sort of come out of that in a way for wildlife art. And leading the charge certainly has been Bateman and Ullberg. And I don't say that simply to praise them on air, but really as a historical fact. You ask yourself, who are the tastemakers? Well, amongst tastemakers are collectors, critics, and art museums. When the famous Canadian McMichael Canadian Art Museum in Toronto, one of the top 3 national art museums in all of Canada, of all the provinces, was looking for an appropriate exhibition to host, regardless of subject, they selected the art of Robert Bateman. And in fact, they premiered that exhibition. And lo and behold, Bob's show, his one-man show there, drew such great attendance that the museum extended the hours during the evenings and on the weekends, and even the run of the show. The show went on to premiere in the U.S. at the famous Joslin Art Museum in Omaha. Kent Ullberg also premiered his one-man show at the Joslin Art Museum, art with a capital A, to use Bob's parlance, and then it went on to other art museums as well. And Ullberg was commissioned to do, I think it was maybe a 6-year endeavor of a public installation, a monument that's second to none, just incredible outdoor installation of bison roaming through the city, chasing up a flock of geese. Incredible things, and accepted by and supported by the elite patrons of that city, as well as the art museum. So Bateman and Ullberg have certainly flip-flopped things around from what they once had been earlier in the 20th century to now where their work, at least, is being accepted by the most elite art institutions in North America.
And there were hanging and being displayed under the same roof with El Greco and Matisse and all the big boys through history. So that's a huge honor.
Yeah, the title and the promotional and the recognition weren't the wildlife art of Robert Bateman or Kent Ullberg, a wildlife art perspective. The exhibitions were entitled simply The Art of Robert Bateman and Kent Ullberg, a retrospective. So the breadth of their work in terms of subject matter, in terms of style, in terms of media, was simply recognized for what it was, great art by 2 great artists.
Well, I'll try to be short with this because David just said something that triggered something in me. I've kind of had this thought before, but I don't think I've verbalized it. These great movements, such as Impressionism and so on, that started all through the entire history of art, were bucking the art critics. And they didn't give a damn what the art critics said. I have a new book out this year called Bateman New Works, which incidentally were all painted during my 70s, I think. And I'll be going around, and I bet you the first question interviewers will ask, or one of the questions is, well, how do you feel about not being in the National Gallery of Canada or the Ontario Art Gallery? And my answer is, listen, of the problem facing the planet, this is the least important. If you gave me 1,000 problems facing the planet, this is the least important problem. It doesn't matter. There's so many things we have to pay attention to and so many things we have to think about. It's kind of fun sparring with the priesthood from time to time when the occasion arises, but it is not an issue, and we don't care.
Let me just mention, Christy, with respect to what is important, there was one review when Bob had his premiere at the McMichael Canadian Art Museum in Toronto, and aspects of the review weren't particularly kind. So actually, the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, held a call-in talk show nationwide, coast to coast, from Nova Scotia to Vancouver, and there were so many callers who lit up the line. It kind of rendered the critic moot, because what they really were, who they really were adoring fans standing up and saying why they loved Robert Bateman's art and expressing it almost representing the entire country from coast to coast. So it was just like a groundswell movement and really moving. It was really quite something.
I felt like sending the critic a bunch of roses. It was just wonderful. And she didn't have any. She said the show. She was ashamed that the McMichael Collection had a show of me because I was too popular. And she heard. She in the review she overheard somebody in the gallery saying, "Oh, at last they're having paintings in this gallery that people can enjoy and understand." She said, "I was so mad I could have kicked them down the stairs." So she really showed her hand there, and I had a big smile on my face reading the entire review. My major show of my career was at the Smithsonian in '87, and it drew record-breaking crowds, which have only been beaten by a baseball show, I understand. And I was reviewed by the Washington Post art critic, which was a great honor, and he panned the show. For similar reasons, the show was too glorious, too beautifully displayed. And he said, but where's the dark underbelly of nature? Where is the tooth and claw and blood? And I do dark underbelly, like an osprey in the rain, and tooth and claw and blood. But there was a botanist who curated the show, and he left all that stuff out. But I thought the critic had an excellent point. Too often we wildlife artists don't show all aspects of nature, but it's all kind of beautiful and prettied up and groomed. And I think I really, although it was a critic, a pan of the show, I felt this guy is a smart guy. He's the Washington Post, and he deserves a pat on the back. I think we need to be shaken up.
And Bob, your new book has a skull of a dead elephant on it, so you have broken that mold.
Yeah, that's right.
But I wanted to say, Bob is absolutely right. New movements have always been in controversy, and I sort of look at wildlife as the Salon de Refusé, when the Impressionists were all rejected from the art establishment, and they went on and they had their own salon, and to people's great delight, so, and it's ongoing, and things are changing. I have done public sculptures in many parts of the world, probably more than 100 of them now, and with wildlife as subject matter. And that was totally unthinkable when I got out of art school in the 60s, and for a long time, like Dave said. So there is a swing, there is a change, and I think we are on the crest, the leading edge of it.
You also pioneered in other sense sculpture. I mean, think about your stainless steel, for example. Who had been doing stainless steel before you were? And that's not really about wildlife art. That's just, an artistic medium.
Right, and that was in response to modern architecture, the international style in Dallas. And yes, I did pioneer the lost wax in method in stainless steel, and it bridged the gap between modern architecture and representation, because it was a highly stylized eagle, but it was still an eagle. And that has, from there on, the changes is ongoing. And like Dave pointed out, downtown Omaha, Nebraska, I was able to use the city as a canvas. I have geese flying through buildings and attached to traffic lights, and bison running through corners of buildings, and basically got to use part of a downtown city with part modern architecture as a canvas for the work. So the changes are here, I believe. And also, of course, when you do public sculpture, I feel when you use public space and public funding, I feel you have an obligation to use a language that communicates. Talk about egotism of putting up something that has no meaning to anybody but yourself, and forcing people when they go to work every day driving by, and it cannot be understood without lengthy explanations, which people, of course, don't get. And like Hilton Kramer said, the more minimal the work, the more maximal the explanation. And there is no time for that in public sculpture.
Putting up a gigantic I-beam, spray painted orange. Most public sculpture, except for Kent's, is very, very boring. But Kent's is wonderful and will stand the test of time.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
And so we're sort of talking about the accessibility of art, and it seems like wildlife art has really always had that, the ability to be accessible to the general public. And it's what you guys were talking about earlier was sort of this idea that if it's popular and commercial, that it somehow has a diminished value. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that started, I think, around the beginning of the 20th century, around 1900, when everybody was in revolt. They had all these isms. Well, we had Trotskyism and Leninism and Marxism and modernism and futurism. Well, modernism sort of lumps them all together. And you had to be a rebel. If it had been done before, it's not worth doing again, was the maxim. Well, you can, if you keep following that philosophy, you end up with Andy Warhol's prediction that everybody in the world will be famous for 15 minutes. And so it's become hopeless, but everything had been done and redone, and now we're into rehash and retro by the 1970s. And that was 40 years ago. And it's been this rehashing back and forth, but these old fossils of that modernist philosophy, if it's been done before, it's not worth doing again. As I say, they'll die off. So I'm not, that's the basis. They say, well, animals have already been done. They were done in the 19th century and maybe the early 20th century, and let's not do them anymore. And they're just wrong. We're doing everything now. I mean, there's abstract art is all over the place, but it's no more modern than realism is. In fact, realism is much more modern than abstract now has been relegated to decor and holiday inns. It's still very nice if you like different colors.
Well, and the extreme, of course, in modernism, you draw that out new until you got to minimalism, where you hang up an empty canvas, and then you have conceptual art where you don't even do anything but talk about it or write about it. And
right.
Where do you go from there,
But overlaying that, I mean, in terms of the art history that we learn in university art history classes, if you think about it, we emerged out of Romanticism to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and Modernism, etc. But while all of that was going on and articulated in books and taught by professors, while that was going on, there were great artists who were classic wildlife artists. One of the best, certainly, and represented by and large at the National Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson is Karl Ronkius. He's not mentioned in many art history books that I know of, pure art history books, but yet he was layered up in the history of culture and doing great stuff while all these others activities and developments were going on. And I think if you look at his work and study it carefully in the gallery, you'll see sort of a symbiotic, to use an overused cliche, I guess, but a symbiotic kind of relationship between, the way his work loosened up from the tight magazine illustrations he was doing in the 1890s, and then after the Armory Show in New York in 1913 and his experience in Banff, his stuff loosened up and it got more painterly, and he was using broad brushwork to sort of create his forms and shapes. And it's just that he's not recognized, I guess, in in art history books by and large. But nonetheless, he is certainly recognized by everyone in this group as being, a foremost practitioner and an important ingredient in the history of wildlife art, if not art in general.
He's a giant, and a giant as a painter in any age. You take a square foot of a rungus, which folks can go and see at the National Museum there. Take a square foot of that and blow it up to 8-foot scale, and it is more exciting and rich and handsome than any de Kooning or any of the great abstract expressionists. It's just beautiful if you get right up and look at it.
I totally agree.
So although there's been some really great artists in history and wildlife art, it's taken until now to sort of break into the larger world of just art without a subtitle of wildlife art.
Yeah, we're not there. We're not there yet, ready to get rid of the subtitle. But as I said, it's a growing. It's like a wave, and Kent touched on it earlier. The natural world is becoming more and more precious and more value. My big growth of my career came along, I swear, in the 80s with that great burst of suburbia. That's where all the dealers were that were selling my prints, and people they didn't care what some eggheads were saying at the austere ivory towers of the art museums. They just knew what they liked, and they knew what was precious, and they knew what was handsome. And it's a very new market, this, and very new awareness, and it's just grown hugely, exponentially since the 80s and all through the 90s. And there's never been more. Actually, all artists in the world who paint Western art and landscape and all kinds of and portraits. There's never been more than there are now, making a living at it, and including more wildlife artists making a living at it than there's ever been before. So it's really burgeoning, and we keep talking about these little ivory towers, and aside from the fact that they control the budgets and the keys to the kingdom of the big museums, they're not important.
Christy, to answer your question, and I would think of it historically, you have to be careful about generalizing too much. And I think you said something about something like that it's just now that wildlife art is becoming accepted. But actually, historically speaking, I mean, the most important artist in England in the second half of the 19th century, the favorite of the Queen of England and the general public, was Sir Edwin Landseer, a great artist of wildlife. But his sort of mindset of his work was not so much toward natural history or environmentalism or conservation as it was allegory. It was meant to symbolize the crown and the stag in the glen, for example, representing the power and the magnificence and the awesomeness of the crown itself. And of course, in this country, a early sculptor, Edward Kemys, had his wildlife work, not only articulate the Great Columbian Exposition of 1892 in Chicago, attended by 6 out of 10 Americans, but in addition, what his sculptures greet you when you enter in my neck of the woods here in the greater upper Midwest, one of the great art institutions, the Art Institute of Chicago, and what are on the staircase to greet you are 2 lions by Edward Kemys. So wildlife, certainly in the 19th century and the tail end of the 19th century, was powerful and accepted, and in fact celebrated. There was this big mega trend that ensued in the early and then the middle part of the 20th century, where all the isms, etc., and more modernistic sort of trends that we call modernism, but really aren't so modern anymore, as Bob points out. There was this downward spiral, and now the wave has come back up. So there are these big mega trends and cyclical kinds of trends in the culture of art that I think are important to understand and know and recognize.
There is one difference, Dave, which of course you know better than anybody, and that was that wildlife, yes, it was indeed used, but it was more as a vehicle for other considerations. For example, the typical one is the Romantics, when they broke with neoclassicism. I'm thinking of the sculptor Barye or Delacroix. They used animal and nature, but as a vehicle for romanticism. The savage nature versus classicism. Idolizing man. and they got soundly beaten for it. They got kicked out of the salon. And like you pointed out, Dave, Landseer was very often a symbolism for royalty. And I'm kind of thinking Chemis was also a symbolism for merging America, the wilderness and that kind of stuff. But today I think wildlife is used more for its own sake, for its own preciousness, for our own, as a symbol for our own concern for the environment. So it's just different use sort of wildlife as symbolism.
You're right, and it's been democratized. It's now just everyone. It's just like so many things in the end of the 20th and early 21st century. It's spreading throughout the entire population, not an elite thing anymore. A woman in California, I don't remember her name, wrote a thesis on the fact that wildlife art has replaced religious art as an icon of goodness. And it used to be you had a crucifix around your neck or on your wall, or a picture of Jesus and the little lamb to show you were a good person. Now you've got a panda on your T-shirt, and that show, or maybe a print by a wildlife artist of an orca or a bald eagle hanging on your wall, and that shows you must be a good person who cares about nature. And so it's reached the entire society now. And I think we're in a very, very healthy position, and so is the National Museum of Wildlife Art.
So, Ken, I just want to clarify. You stated that historically wildlife art has been used as a vehicle for some other concept. But I'm wondering, aren't we using wildlife art as a vehicle for conservation today?
Yeah, well, I mean, for its own sake, meaning precious in itself, and so the value for conserving it, Wildlife is part of nature and our environment, and they are the symbols. The panda has become the symbol of our own fragility, and how much we are dependent on nature. So there's more to focus on wildlife for its own sake rather than expressing, well, I guess you're right in a way. It's still a symbol, still a vehicle, I guess. You might be right there, Christy.
And I wanted to ask you if you think it is effective, if it's actually working. Are these images actually raising awareness about conservation and the fact that we need to worry about our environment?
I just want to say in a quick example that I use in some of my lectures, big oil companies using nature's images for their advertising. I know there was one big golf oil company had a panda, for example. Obviously, these images have power. The tail of a whale that people wear around the neck, those images have become powerful as symbols. What do you guys think?
I'm sitting here at an airport looking out at the tail of an airplane, it's covered with wildlife art.
You're right, Dave. Yes, Frontier Airlines. Yes.
Right. It's working, but we have to watch this. I think it's in the right direction, but we're not there yet. It's greenwashing, of course, in the case of the oil companies, and selling real estate or you name it. Wildlife and nature is central to advertising and promotion, and that's a good thing, I think, because it's changing consciousness. But it isn't changing people deep down enough to know the reason that they've got to make some sacrifices if they want to share this world with other living things, and that they have to pay attention to the bad news. Well, I'll say this at the risk of offending some people, but too often the Chinese, for example, think if they capture, some Chinese think if they capture all the pandas and put them in zoos, then and they have a good breeding program, then everybody will come and pay their fees and come over to China to see the pandas in zoos, and they may make the zoos very pretty, and they'll plant bamboo and stuff like that, and then they can do whatever they want. They can rape and pillage the real panda habitat. So we need to bridge that gap and realize that yes, the oil spill was terrible in the Gulf, but what's even more terrible is the dead zone, which is as big as Massachusetts, out at the mouth of the Mississippi, where nothing is living because we want to have agribusiness so we can have cheap food. So we pour all the chemicals and pharmaceuticals, feeding to livestock and so on, into the drainage pattern, and it goes down the Mississippi, and it's killed everything. and it's unseen. So we've got to bridge that gap if we want to have a good future for our grandchildren. But we're on the way, and at least changing consciousness. But we got to look at the dark underbelly, as that art critic of the Washington Post said.
Well, the fact that I think museums and collectors value paintings and sculptures of artists like Ullberg and Bateman, and spend big money to acquire them and to preserve them and save them for posterity, denotes that there's real value to them, and perhaps not all their work show the dark side or have overt messages to correct the difficult situation that we find ourselves in with global warming or whatnot. But they are reminders nonetheless, and reminders of the beauty of nature and the value that we put on preserving nature and through the preservation of that art. So I think they're pretty powerful signifiers of what is maybe something really deep down in the hearts and minds of people everywhere.
This makes me want to read a quote from Robert that was written in your book, David. Robert writes, "I feel that the significance of wildlife art in raising public consciousness about the need to protect nature is generally overrated. In fact, most wildlife art is so sweet and easy to swallow that it can be soporific and lull the public into a bland acceptance of the status quo."
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that's the problem with greenwashing, that we become satisfied. So, all these smiling faces around BP's boardroom can, sort of pat themselves on the back while we've got some nice greenwashing there. So that's a lot cheaper than actually putting, real enforcement into effect on safety with offshore drilling, etc. Yeah, I think that's very true. Speaking personally, I'm an oddball. Although I think TV is very dangerous and is 99% junk, I have the television on every evening, but I hate commercials, so I only watch PBS and other non-commercial shows. And I find that nature shows are, I'm afraid, unless they're terrific ones, like the ones that are now done by Attenborough, as I mentioned, some of the BBC shows, I find them kind of like elevator music. Music is okay in the elevators, but it's all sweet and nice. And I would way rather watch a hard-hitting show on political policy that's going to affect nature, say Frontline on PBS, than watch a nice, sweet nature show.
Christy, I might mention about both Bob and Kent and other artists, wildlife artists, that they have put their money where their mouth is, their pocketbook, and supported through their art many causes and organizations that are active in the conservation movement. So it's not simply the imagery and the message embodied in their art itself, but actually the economic value and putting that that towards supporting conservation activities.
Well, that's great to see somebody actually putting their money where their mouth is. As we close this up, I just want to know what each of your opinions are on what the current state of wildlife art is right now, and where you'd like to see it go.
Well, I've never been one to prescribe a direction to artists, and I'd really it sounds like not a very like maybe I'm not very visionary in that regard, but I think that's really something that's up to the artists. I mean, they have to speak from their heart. They have to express their concerns. They have to express their aesthetic, the beauty that they see in their composition and design and their style and their media. So that's really not something that I have ever in the past championed, and I guess I wouldn't be in a position to right now. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's an honest answer. Thank you.
Okay. I for one think it's never been healthier. It has a great future. I've just come from two magnificent international shows, giant annual shows, the Society of Animal Artists in San Diego weekend before this, and the annual Bird Art Show at the Leake Woodson Art Museum in Wausau, Wisconsin, which is a great. They're both a great gathering of the clans of the cream of the crop in the world. They come from all over over the world, Japan and Germany and Holland and Russia and of course mostly from the States, but also from Canada. And boy, those young hotshots are getting very, very good. If you flip through the catalogs through the years, they're terrific. They're thinking artists. They're daring. They're taking more risks, and they're supporting themselves. When I was a teenager, I was painting birds before I went into Impressionism and abstracts and all that kind of thing, and there were 3 bird artists in all of Canada, and I was one of them, and I was a teenager. Now there's hundreds, and there's certainly dozens that are supporting themselves very well, and they're doing terrific stuff. It's really come. See, I'm an old guy, and I've seen it come along, starting in the late '70s and the '80s. There were the giants like Cunard and Rungius and Lilliefors and so on that were historic figures. But now there's a lot of them, and if you want to make a living as an artist, you're probably fairly well off to concentrate on wildlife as a young person. Certainly, the abstract artists and the modernist artists that now basically do installations, they can't make a living unless they get a grant. Their whole basis of their existence is based on grants. On writing, they're better at writing grant proposals than they are doing art. But I think the wildlife art is in its ascendancy, and I can't be more positive.
I feel very much the same, and I just want to point out as well. This weekend we have a giant reception at the National Museum of Wildlife Art. Annual function, and there are artists there from all over the world. My colleagues from Sweden, Brits, from all over the place, and incredibly supported by collectors, by sponsors, and it's one of the big happenings as well. In addition to the ones that Bob mentioned, unfortunately, I cannot be there. I will be in Lake Charles, Louisiana, unveiling another public sculpture that was commissioned to talk about rebuilding after the Hurricane Rita, and they did the whole lakefront was destroyed, and they have done wonderful restoration, and they did a fountain of mine with white-fronted geese, which they love, and in the old days, meaning 30, 40 years ago, it would probably be a couple of I-beams to symbolize the recovery, and today they are the most beloved geese. They really love the white-fronted geese there that travel all the way from the high Arctic to spend their winters on their lake. And that's what they like to have as a symbol of the recovery from Rita. So, and there are more and more public sculptures, speaking about my field, with wildlife art everywhere. And lots of us are doing very well with it, including the Omaha project, like I talked about, which was a 10-year project. I spent 10 years of my life filling downtown Omaha with nature's images.
Well, it sounds fabulous. And I was just thinking, I feel that this modernist art, this minimalist art, they're already has-beens. They are done. But art based on realism, particularly realism to do with nature and the living world, has a terrific, promising future. At least the art does, and let's hope that nature does as well, if we can only pay attention.
Wow, it's really cool to hear from all these different perspectives in one conversation. So it's been really great talking to you guys today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been fabulous for me. It's been fun hearing those guys. It's been great. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you so much, Christy. I loved it.
And, of course, you can hear more from Dr. David Wagner this Wednesday at 4 p.m. In the Jackson Room of the Ward Hotel, where he will be speaking and signing his book. This event is sponsored by the Jackson Hole Historical Society and Museum. You can also get more information about our guest today at our website at www.jhcr.org. We'll put up some links there that will have some extra information for you. Special thanks to Karen Reinhardt at the Historical Museum and also to the National Wildlife Art Museum for helping us with the research of this interview. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Christy Koryakin, and you're tuned in to KHOL 89.1.